is that Connor Daly, has a relationship there. He ran in the Indy 500. I have an article on AR1 about Connor Daly. I think Connor Daly's a stud. I think he checks out in every single column possible. Plus, for the commercial viability of the sport, like, I don't know how else to emphasize this enough. Connor Daly went to high school 13 miles from the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Like, that's good. Connor Daly has been trained in the cutthroat European Junior Formula. The kid is 100% ready for IndyCar. I would love to see him on the grid. I don't know if it's going to happen. I think he's, I've gotten the sense he's just flat out of money. But, we'll see what happens there. But anyway, nonetheless, I think Foyt is going to be Sato or Daly. 75% I think it's going to be Sato. Okay, let's go to the number 10 Ganassi car. Where to begin here? This is interesting with the 10 Ganassi car. I've kind of gotten it down to the point where I think it's going to be some people who are either going to drive that car or they're not going to be an Indy car. In other words, Sergio Perez is going to drive for Ganassi or he's not going to race Indy cars. He's going to go back to Formula One or something. Paul di Resta is going to drive for Ganassi or he's going to drive in Formula One. Okay? Like, Paul di Resta is not going to take the Panther seat or something. Okay? I suppose that could be a Ryan Briscoe, an Alex Tagliani, or an Oriol Servia. If you take those three, I personally like Servia the best. Okay, we're back. Last segment we talked about the silly season. This segment here, we're going to talk about the whole electronic cigarettes thing. I've been reading a little bit about this. This is very interesting. This is sort of a business of racing element. Obviously, racing is a lot different than other sports in that you need a lot of money to make exotic automobiles go fast. It's not a this is a rich man's game, and you need corporate sponsors who are willing to bankroll it. And of course, tobacco companies have throughout racing history been incredibly supportive. I mean, they've just poured, Brinks trucks worth of cash multiple Brinks trucks worth of cash into the sport of racing as a whole. And of course, some of the iconic cars in the sport's history have been tobacco liveried. I think of the Silk Cut Jaguars or the Marlboro cars in both Formula One and IndyCar. My personal favorite car of all time in any racing were the Players cars. Back in the day. You also had the Cool cars and Camel sponsored Formula One. You had Lucky Strike, and it goes on and on. I could go on about it for days. But nevertheless, tobacco companies have been a big supporter of the sport. The sport, and a study, doing a study on this would be very interesting, but the sport has lost the tobacco companies in the last however many years. And a lot of that has to do with legislation. There's been a lot of anti-tobacco legislation, tobacco advertising, so on and so forth. Marlboro, Cool, whoever else, don't advertise in IndyCar, they don't advertise in Formula One. Of course, NASCAR was supported by Winston for all those years. NASCAR, being the incredibly savvy business operation that it is, slowly weaned itself off the tobacco industry, and found sort of other sponsors. IndyCar, they don't really have a business plan, at least not one that I'm aware of. It's probably hurt them as much too. In other words, these companies aren't throwing the dollars at the sport that they once did. Now, this is interesting. You have electronic cigarettes that have essentially come into the sport, and they haven't come in sort of head first necessarily. The Blue e-cigs company sponsored the Ray Hall Letterman Lanigan team in a few races last year. It was a part-time sponsor. Great livery, by the way. And earlier this week, November 19th, that was Wednesday, I believe. no, it was Tuesday. KVSH Racing announced Mystic Electronic cigarettes would be on the number 11 KV Chevrolet, piloted by Sebastian Bourdais. KVSH Chevrolet. That's going to take some getting used to. Okay, so this looks like, at least in the short term, and maybe this can go further, but there's another revenue stream that's now open, okay, is that these electronic cigarette companies are coming in. Now, the angle that the electronic cigarette companies are playing is that the electronic cigarette essentially give smokers kind of the nicotine fix without the tar, the chemicals, the carbon monoxide of quote-unquote real cigarettes. And they're also sort of marketed as a cheap, kind of healthy way for smokers to quit smoking and to avoid the deleterious effects of traditional cigarettes. Now, again, I'm not a scientist, but essentially the way that it works is that the electronic cigarettes have nicotine, okay, and the nicotine is essentially ignited, okay, and then the smoker takes in the nicotine. The nicotine is ignited and liquidizes and becomes vapor, okay, and then they inhale the nicotine. So it has the nicotine fix, but it doesn't have the chemicals of other cigarettes. Okay, now, this is interesting because a few people are going to, a few people are obviously going to oppose this. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. And I'll be honest with you guys, I rely on the article in the Washington Examiner by a gentleman by the name of Timothy P. Carney, okay, friend of the show. But what it is that big pharma is beginning, like the pharmaceutical companies. For example, Johnson & Johnson makes Nicorette gum. I'm sorry, GlaxoSmithKline sells Nicorette gum. Johnson & Johnson makes nicotine patches. These companies are essentially opposing the e-cigarettes because the e-cigarettes, in a sense, are an alternative to traditional methods to quit tobacco smoke. Okay? Also, the e-cigarettes are coming under some fire in terms of are they really not as bad as people think? Because, again, nobody's necessarily going around saying that the e-cigarettes in and of themselves are healthy. Like, in other words, like nobody's saying that, hey, you should have e-cigarettes instead of broccoli. Like, nobody's saying that. What the angle is that it's the lesser evil than cigarettes, and that it helps people to quit cigarette smoke. Okay, there was a study done in Italy that indicated this. Now, of course, because this stuff gets politicized, there was a counter study that said that the study in Italy was bogus. Okay, you can go back and forth. Okay, I guess for the purposes of IndyCar, and I mean, you didn't necessarily tune in to listen to me talk about electronic cigarettes, but they do have a tie-in with IndyCar, and for the purposes of IndyCar, this could be a real good revenue stream for the sport, okay? Racetracks are, of course, places where the cigarette companies used to promote products and such, and the racetracks would be an obvious place for the electronic cigarettes companies to promote products. This could result in money coming into the sport. The question is, will the electronic cigarette industry be able to kind of withstand the actual lobbying and sort of political pressure? They have won a few court cases. There is some legislation against it. There are people who say, well, the effects long-term aren't known. Okay, but this does have the potential, because another problem I think that IndyCar has, a lot of their sponsors are no longer consumer brands. In other words, let's see, NTT Data, who sponsors Kanan's car. That's not a consumer. Like, Tim, do you use NTT Data?
What is that?
Exactly. Tim, do you use United Fiber and Data?
Wish I knew what that was, too.
Okay. My perfect example. Tim drinks Coke, right?
Yeah.
Tim drinks Coke. Okay, Coke's a consumer company. But in other words, the sport doesn't have necessarily that relevance because it doesn't have those consumer brands. These are potential consumer brands. that kind of give the sport that connection that it once had. So this is a story I'm following because this has real potential to be another revenue stream for IndyCar racing, sort of another way of the sport kind of gaining greater visibility. The question, of course, becomes, will it stand up in the courts? Where will the legislation for or against this type of thing, or these electronic cigarettes, go in the future? I don't know. But I'm very intrigued by the whole electronic cigarettes element. Okay, well, that's going to wrap up our show for today. I want to thank John Lingle for joining us with his insights. I wish him the best of luck with the book. Hopefully, you can tune in next time to the AR1 podcast, and we will see you then.